Can you hear now? Yes. So, hey everyone. Imagination, and to go beyond a magical perspective of imagination. I'd like to think about imagination for a democratic society in line with the theme of the conference. And I'd like to ask, what is imagination? We'll have a working definition for imagination, and we'll then look at it through an evolutionary, psychological, and visual arts lens. And then we'll think about implications for practice. So I think, first of all, to think about imagination in a democratic society, we need a definition of imagination. And I really like John Dewey's definition about having a responsible share, according to capacity, in forming and directing the groups to which one belongs. And I think that implies for us that our role as educators is to make sure that everybody reaches their full potential and fulfills their capacity for imagination. And that will demand critical thinking, our ability to see things for what they are. And we know that the arts are really good for helping us to develop critical thinking. But we need more than that, because as Maxine Green says, people trying to be more fully human must not only engage in critical thinking, but must be able to imagine something coming of their hopes. We need to be able to go further, particularly in today's world. I don't think I've ever felt as if I live in a dystopian science fiction novel any more than I have in the last couple of years. And as Noam Chomsky says, we need optimism to overcome despair so that we can have some hopes for the future. And imagination is key for that. I'm sure most people in this audience will relish the idea of imagination. And I think when arts educators talk about imagination, it's with a twinkle in their eye and butterflies in their stomachs. And don't get me wrong, imagination is magical. But we live in a scientific paradigm. And I think sometimes we need to be able to explain and define imagination more than we do. We're quite good at breaking down the process of creativity, but less good at talking about imagination. What is imagination? So Reuland, a 16th century alchemist, said that imagination is the star in man, and presumably in women too. Hume said that it's what reproduces impressions so that we can think about things in their absence. So we start to arrive at a sort of process, a cognitive process involving imagination with that description. And then Einstein says that imagination is more important than knowledge because it takes us further than the knowledge that we already have. It takes us beyond. So here's a working definition of imagination so that we can think about it properly. And let's think about some different kinds of imagination. So if you like, you can close your eyes, but what I'd like you to do is to imagine an animal, a real animal, but not an animal which is in this room. So not a human or any other animal that you could see. Let's call that imaging. Bringing to mind what is not present, but which exists in experience or has been perceived. Next, what I'd like you to do is to give your animal a friend. Again, a real animal, which is somehow similar to the animal that you imagined in the first place, but has some differences too. And let's call that productive imagination, combining imagery or mental representations from existing experiences. And now put your two animals into an environment that you wouldn't normally think of them being in. Again, a real place, but somewhere you wouldn't really expect to see them. And let's call that creative imagination, combining and applying imagery with relative originality. So someone else might have imagined these animals in this place, but you haven't. So it's relatively original, and we're thinking about creativity as being defined by original thinking. And then finally, give your animals some superpowers. Let them do things that they couldn't possibly do in real life. And we'll call that fantastical imagination, creating images which have never existed in real experience. And perhaps this is the kind of imagination that we most often attribute to children or think of at first when we think of imagination. Oh, apologies for the slip on the different system. But let's look through an evolutionary lens at imagination now. So I would argue that imagination has enabled evolutionary transcendence. So at some point in our human history, our brains grew, and imagination produced and then developed human self-awareness. We became aware of our place in the universe, and we developed a theory of mind. Having a theory of mind is probably essential to social complexity, and most probably a prerequisite for the evolution of language. So imagination enabled us to become socially complex human beings and allowed us to develop language. Actually, self-awareness raises quite a lot of challenges. It's quite a frightening thing to be able to consider yourself as a tiny being in the middle of this humongous universe, and to actually know that at some point you're going to die and you don't know where you're going to go. And all of a sudden, with an increased capacity for imagination, you can start to think about things which aren't real, which don't fit with your pre-programmed sense of being in this world. And you start to have these ill-fitting thoughts, as Stephen Mithen describes here. And some evolutionary psychologists say that this is when our capacity for making art developed. So we took these ideas and put them outside of us in the form of a carving or a painting. And these images acted as a cognitive anchor for concepts, so that within the presence of those images, the idea could be recalled, manipulated, and shared. So these cultural objects were externalized symbolic storage used for our working memory space. So if you put something outside of yourself, you don't have to bring it to mind to think about it. It's there in front of you. And that actually frees up space in your working memory. And it eases your cognitive load. So what we tended to do was we were really interested in space and time and big concepts like that. So Stonehenge and places like that allowed the storage and analysis in this external device of complex information. And of course, they also allowed us to come together and interact around those objects so that we could pool and share our knowledge. So imagination as culture, therefore, enabled social development. So what you end up with is a kind of iterative cycle, where imagination enables self-awareness, and then it enables us to deal with that self-awareness, perhaps by making art. And then that art creates socio-cultural awareness and extends our imagination further, so that as humans we become more self-aware of our place as humans and of our potential as humans. So what I'm saying really is that it's imagination which has enabled us to develop as human beings. Let's look through a psychological lens now. So I want to talk about the ideas of Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, both key theorists in terms of child development. So Piaget said that actually the child has no imagination. There's no such thing as imagination. All it really is a series of thoughts which kick in when there is a gap in our understanding about the world. Vygotsky has a different approach, and he thinks that imagination is the basis of all creativity. And actually all of our products of thought and all of the cultural products around us could not exist without imagination. It's a much more constructive approach. But both agree that we use mental images which we hold in an image store in our minds, and that these images are rooted in our sensory experience of the world around us. We symbolically code these sense perceptions and hold them in our minds as mental imagery. And when there is some sort of disequilibrium or imbalance in our understanding, our imagination kicks in as a sort of driving force to connect the images that we have and make sense and make meaning of our experience. And we use these images towards the construction of schema, of concepts and patterns of thinking which help us to form knowledge. So there are some key differences between the conceptions of imagination which Piaget and Vygotsky have, which I think are useful to look at. So Piaget thought that children are more imaginative than adults, and this is revealed when they play, where gaps in realistic understanding are filled by imagination. So for example, if a child doesn't really understand how a flower grows, they might say that a fairy sprinkles magic dust on the earth and a flower pops up. And he says that imagination is needed more in early development and decreases as we move from quite distinct stages of egocentric learning towards more logical and abstract thought. Now, I struggle with this because I don't understand how we can have logical and abstract thought without using imaging and productive imagination, which we looked at earlier. Vygotsky, on the other hand, says that children are less sophisticated than adults in their use of imagination. And I wonder if this sort of lies in the way that we often think of children's imagination as fantastical imagination, and that's the first thing we think of when we think of imagination, rather than its more basic aspects. But Vygotsky thinks that imagination is intrinsically linked to our concept development, and we always need it. So it's just that as our thought becomes more sophisticated and more grounded in reality, our imagination is completely intertwined with that and develops as our general thinking develops. So Piaget's model is a kind of deficit model where imagination fills conceptual gaps. And it's almost as if that's based on a belief that the truth is out there, that there is knowledge, there are facts about the world, and we are receivers of that truth. Whereas Vygotsky's model is a constructive model, an expansion model, where we use imagination to expand concepts. And we have a role in building knowledge, and we'll return to this in a minute. So just a reminder of the types of imagination that we looked at earlier, and let's work through them. So let's think about imaging, first of all. So mental images are used as building blocks in a store in our minds. And these images come from any kind of sensed experience. I tend to think of them as visual, but they can be about touch and about smell and about sound. And the nature of these images is that they are analog images. They don't work like fixed photographs. They're very malleable. So Homer can turn this donut into a chocolate donut if he wants to. He can make it the biggest donut in the world if he wants to, because the previous experience that he's had allows him to manipulate it in that way. He can think about that. But these mental images are the tools for the creation of products of imagination, and mastering them takes place through interaction with cultural objects and through development of the symbolic function. And I think that implies a huge role for artistic and cultural experiences. I think art helps us to think. So productive imagination is about combining these images so that we can generalize, we can categorize, and therefore we can retain information. And this is all about syncretistic imagination, about making connections between mental imagery, connecting images to form concepts and schema. So I can put Homer's donut in a group of cakes and biscuits, or I can put it in a group of round things, and then I can have all sorts of thoughts coming off in different groups from there. The conditions for this movement of imagery are uncertainty, disequilibrium, or even rupture. So by rupture, what I mean is that you have some sort of experience which completely makes your previous thinking obsolete, and you have to rearrange your thoughts in order to come to settle on a new understanding. So again, it's whether we are filling gaps in our knowledge or whether we're constructing knowledge. And I think that's quite an important thing to consider, because I think if we're filling gaps in our knowledge, that implies quite a passive role for the learner. This is something that Freire talks about well. That's a model where the individual is a spectator, not a recreator. And I much prefer Vygotsky's constructive model, because in terms of supporting a democratic society, it means that we are the constructors of knowledge and we're much more empowered. So thinking about creative imagination, this is about moving towards a product which is relatively original. And imagination is what gives us freedom from truth-bound cognitions, enabling novelty. So within imagination, we can hypothesize, we can suppose, we can hope, we can be curious, and we can have desires. And of course, art is a perfect non-truth-bound space for that kind of cognitive activity. Let's move on now to fantastical imagination. So in his book, The Uses of Enchantment, Bruno Bettelheim talks about the way that humans have used fairy tales in order to work out their problems and their fears. And that in these fairy tales, you can defeat the wicked witch or whatever obstacle is in your way. And actually, through that process, you can become a more hopeful, more positive human being, kind of more adapted for survival. For me, the Star Wars films are kind of an example of a modern-day fairy tale which helps with this. And I went to see Rogue One shortly after President Trump was elected, and it did raise my spirits a little bit. So if we step through the looking glass, like Alice, into the fantastical world of imagination, there's an opportunity here for removed thought, and we can focus on the essence of a problem as opposed to being caught up in the literalness of a problem, a literal representation of it. And we can do anything we like. We can superimpose categories of experience, break any boundary that we like, have complete freedom so that we can explore possibilities and resolutions to problems. And of course, arts are the perfect playground for that. So what I would ask at this point is, having looked at those different aspects of imagination, what is left of our cognition? What do we do in our thinking without imagination? If you take the basic part of imagination to be a mental image and the combination of mental images, can you think of much that you think about without the use of mental images? So furthermore, I want to look at metacognitive imagination. So by metacognition, I mean understanding and having skills for our learning. And for me, this is very important because there's a wealth of research which says that if we become metacognitive, we will become much more successful learners. We will achieve and even attain more in school. Children, there are significant differences in children's attainment if they've developed their metacognition in schools. This is an important argument in England, where the arts are very much under threat. So metacognition can generally be broken down into metacognitive knowledge, knowing how we learn, and metacognitive skill, having strategies for our learning. So knowledge depends on imaginative reflection. We need to bring to mind images of our previous learning experience in order to understand how we learn. And we'll need to combine them, and we'll probably need creative imagination in order to cohere meaning from those. And in terms of skill, personal strategies for learning are necessarily relatively original. They're only about that person. And therefore, we're using creative imagination there. I think in both cases, we would use fantastical imagination because we might like to think about the impossible in order to be able to better consider the reality or the possible. And metacognition is a transcendental perspective. It's consciousness about our own learning or our own consciousness. And we've already said that imagination is what enables transcendence. So we need to be imaginative to be metacognitive. So, imagination is a fundamental aspect of metacognition, which increases achievement and attainment in learning. Therefore, we should be developing imagination. Let's relate this now to an arts perspective. So if art supports imagination, and I would think that everybody here thinks that it does, and imagination is a fundamental aspect of cognition and metacognition, then art supports cognition and metacognition. But again, we don't often spell out the special links between art and imagination, and it's useful to think about what they are. So I've put them down to these 5 things: to imagery, freedom, metaphor, experience, and transcendence. So I would say that art processes model cognitive processes which use mental imagery. And I would also argue that art is predominantly a cognitive activity which uses technical skill as part of that process, and that's arguable. And I think mental images are the cognitive material for art. So I'd like to show you Pavio's model of dual coding, which has come out very badly here. Sorry about that. Okay, so Pavio says that we have sensory experiences, our perceptions enter our minds, and we code that experience in one of 2 ways. We code it verbally, and this is the image on the left with the blocks, okay? Or we code it as mental imagery, like pictures. Okay? There are advantages in coding things as imagery in terms of being able to recall that information and in terms of being able to manipulate that information. It enables flexible thinking. And while everybody uses both of these kinds of coding and they complement each other and integrate, what Pavio has found in his research is that we use mental imagery more than we use verbal coding. Okay, so by nurturing a visual vocabulary and language, which I would say we can do very well through art, we might increase the potential of our imagination and increase our cognitive flexibility so that art-based experience can help us to be better thinkers generally. And I think that artists and creative practitioners expertly model mental image manipulation. Okay, so our second theme our second sort of special link between imagination and art is that art provides freedom to imagine. So because there is this dominance of flexible mental imagery, and art supports the generation of hypothetical knowledge, it's not about arriving at a scientific fact or a mathematical equation. It invites syncretistic thought. It invites us to make connections in our thinking. And this is necessarily based in our previous experience. Therefore, acts of meaning-making are always personal and self-directed because we can only draw on our own personal understandings of things. And because there are no right or wrong answers, art is an environment for free, imaginative, and autonomous thought. And of course, that links into the idea of democracy. And Elliot Eisner explains all of this very well. I think also, fantastical imagination is allowed and encouraged in art, and we can go to the most awful places or to the most wonderful places and do whatever we like. It's an opportunity for autonomy which enables us to create our own meanings and to imagine and to instigate change. So another link is that art operates in terms of metaphor. The language of art is metaphorical. One thing is talked about in terms of another. Lakoff and Johnson have done a lot of research and talk about the way that metaphor is actually a fundamental aspect of our conceptual system. They say that all of our thinking is organized in terms of a set of metaphors, and that that's reflected in our speech. So an easy example is that they say that we often conceptualize learning as a journey, and when we talk about learning, we'll talk about it in those terms. So the argument here is that if art develops our capacity to use metaphor, if it exercises that capacity, that will support our general cognitive capacity. It will help with the rest of our thinking. It's kind of a focused way of using metaphor. Furthermore, metaphors create tensions and boundary crossing. So if I said something like, her mind was like a stormy sea, on the one hand, you know that a mind is not like a stormy sea. It's not wet. There's no weather. Okay, you're not going to drown. But on the other hand, you will make the connection that her mind is turbulent, like this stormy sea. So metaphors nurture cognitive flexibility, they help us to make connections, and we use all different kinds of imagination in order to apply and manipulate them. Art as experience after John Dewey's work. So art is not finished when we stop working on it or looking at it. It does have a bit of a life of its own. It's very organic, and it lives on in our minds. So there's a two-way relationship between art and the audience or the maker, which can result in some sort of imaginative or cognitive transformation. It creates one-off learning situations where interpretations, meanings, permutations depend on individuals and individual experiences and result in cognitive transformation. So if you encounter a piece of art, that might shift your thinking. If you make a piece of art, that might cohere your thinking into a meaning. That stays with you. It doesn't just end there. It's not a fact which is complete. It goes on and transforms. So art stimulates never-ending imagination. And finally, back to this, I think, key concept of transcendence. So art invites us to stand back from ourselves and to reimagine our experience as human beings. And if we take human experience to be the same as learning, again, that's debatable, but no time here. Art allows us to reflect on and develop our learning. So that's metacognitive, okay? Especially if we're conscious that art reflects learning. So if you're working with children and they understand that part of the role of art is to reflect human experience and to reflect human learning, they can then use that art experience to reflect on themselves and their own learning if they're very conscious of that. So art permeates and transforms how we imagine ourselves. And our developed imagination can then enable us to transform ourselves and our society. So in conclusion, imagination is a fundamental aspect of cognition and metacognition, grounded in sensory experience. It enables transcendental thought and provides cognitive space which facilitates creative thinking. It underpins meaning-making as reflected in visual art. And it's a means of accommodating and cohering disparate perspectives towards richer learning and more meaningful and democratic existence. Now, we don't want our imaginations to decay and become corrupted and subject to external influences that we might not deem healthy. What can we do about that? So here are some suggestions for pedagogy in practice. I think that we need to advocate art as a cognitive and metacognitive activity rather than treat it as a talent or a gift. So I don't know if it's the same in Sweden, but in England I don't think we do this well enough. We don't emphasize that it's a cognitive and metacognitive activity. We often think of it as a technical skill, and we often think of it as being something that you're born with, more so than a capacity for maths or physics. It's often talked about as some sort of gift. And I think we need to move away from that. We need to emphasize that critical and creative thinking, which are both 21st century skills competencies, depend on imagination. And we need to provide broad cultural experiences, and I would add in here first-hand experiences with artists, including contemporary art experiences which link directly to children's lives. We need to develop arts-based pedagogies which support metacognition and autonomy. So this robot is from a project called Mapping Transformation Through Contemporary Art, which was a project with the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art in Gateshead in the north of England. And in this project, children were asked to make a sculpture which represented themselves as a learner. So this example of this resilient robot is from a boy who said that he'd made this because even though this robot was battered and bashed, it would still keep on going. When it was faced with tests at school, it wouldn't give in, it would keep on going through the tests, which I think says a lot about the English education system at the moment. And I think we need to support personal paths through art making and interpretation. Not everybody making the same thing, making it more personal than that. And of course, we need to evaluate and visualize process above product. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. And please sit down.